So in this video I want to demystify salting of a steak for you. Why should you or why should you not? I mean, there's so many mixed messages out there with no real sort of conclusion or explanation in terms of scientific backup. I mean, you know, the hows and the whys, that's what I'm interested. So I want to cut through all of that for you today and to explain you salting of a steak from a scientific view mixed with kitchen reality. Now, who am I? I'm Walter Trupp. I used to run and manage some of Europe's best restaurants. Today, I run my own cooking school. Now, when it comes to cooking, it's quality of produce mixed with cooking techniques and chemistry that turn you into a master chef. If you understand that, then all things cooking become really easy. Then you can tap yourself on the shoulder and say, well done, well done. I hope that's not the way you like your steak. But if you do, I have the ultimate answer for you in this video too. Now, towards the end of this video, I will once and forever demystify you. How often should you turn your steak and when? And let's get straight into the basics, your steak itself. Now, fat in steak is most likely responsible for all of the flavor. For example, think of a tenderloin steak versus a Scotch fillet. Now, tenderloin is a muscle that's literally underused a lot, hence it does not need much energy, hence it doesn't have developed much fat or collagen in its tissue. Now, a Scotch fillet on the other side comes from a muscle that is used much more, hence it needs more energy, hence it has more fat as well as collagen. Does that make sense to you? Now, for example, if you would taste a raw Scotch fillet and a raw eye fillet, more or less they would taste exactly the same. But once you then cook them, the flavor changes. The texture will change too, to some extent, due to the amount of collagen in the meat. Additionally, the fat in the meat will give you a much better mouthfeel and stimulate your brain, just like umami or kokumi does. And it's found in recent study that fat might be a flavor by itself. Now, meat muscles are made from thousands and thousands of hair-thin strands, which are packed with moisture and protein. So in case of your tenderloin, little fat is involved, and this makes it hard for a lean muscle to maintain its moisture during cooking. Hence, it turns dry much quicker than a piece of steak, for example, that contains a lot of fat, like a Scotch fillet does. So if it's flavor that you're after, you need a steak that has a lot of fat. The other thing that gives your steak a lot of flavor has to do with the age of the cow. Now, have you ever heard of myoglobin? No? Well, as the animal grows older, it develops more and more myoglobin. Now, if the animal is active on top of it, it uses its muscle much more and naturally develops more fat between the meat fibers as well as much more myoglobin. Now, you can recognize higher levels of myoglobin when the meat has a much darker color, which you see in older animals. The more myoglobin, the more flavor. So an older cow is basically a much better steak, and that the meat from older cows is tougher is literally a myth. It's all about how it's raised. However, in case of slow cooking, yes, such meats would have a longer cooking time simply due to the fact of more developed connective tissue, collagen and elastin, but that's a different story. Check out my video on beef burgundy to learn all about that. And now back to the fat of our steaks. Now, when cooking your fat marbled steak then reacts with the heat, the fat oxidizes in the heat, it melts, it makes the steak really juicy and really tender and much better tasting. The tenderloin that lacks in fat does not change much, and it becomes more and more dense and more dry. So my tip here is, if you want your steak well done, and may God forgive you, then you go for a steak that has a lot of fat, like a Scotch fillet or ribeye or something like that, and that will then come across much more tender than, for example, if you get a well-done tenderloin that's really dry. So I hope these are a few useful tips for when you choose your steak. So when should you salt your meat? I know a lot of people tell you that you should do it 5 or 10 minutes before, but it's all about timing. If you salt your steak 5 or 10 minutes before, you better don't bother and rather season it after cooking. Why? Well, if you add salt to your meat and you let it stand for a few minutes, it actually will make the surface of your meat a little dry and a bit chewy, because the salt starts to draw out the moisture of the outer layers and creating a surface brine, or sweat we call it. You then cook such a steak, you will have several problems. First, the steak will rather start to stew because you have a layer of juice between the steak and the pan, and it will not brown, and you have to cook away the brine, and the steak will take much longer. You're not going to get any color on it. Second, the salt will actually not stay in the meat, it will pass out, as it was shown in scientific tests, and end up in the pan. Now, if your steak is then cut thin, you most likely have overcooked it by the time you got any color onto your steak. So you basically fucked it, you know what I mean? Well done. That's how your steak's gonna be. Sorry, but it's just the way it is. So next stuff up, you add the salt just before you place it in the pan, and you have the salt sitting between the meat and the pan. The steak surface cannot touch the pan and you get undercooked gray spots. Basically, your steak will not brown, less Maillard reaction, less flavor. Plus, it will not look great when you put it on your plate. And if you salt it the last minute, you need to salt it after cooking. Basically, just when you turn off the heat, when you rest your meat. That's the only way the salt does not disrupt the cooking process of the meat. I hope that makes sense. Try it out. So I covered the cooking, but I have not shown you my secret pan frying tip to get the ideal color onto your steak. For that, I will need to get my favorite steak pan, and where did I put it? Oh, I think it's in the cupboard over there.
Scheiße! Oh my god! Oh yeah!
Here it is. You heat your pan. Now you need to cook your steak in butter. So I add the butter cold to my pan, and as the pan heats, the butter will clarify itself, and when it gets a little brown, I add the steak. Now butter is milk solids, and they will give your steak an amazing flavor, something you cannot achieve with clarified butter or oil. Plus, oil is no good anyway on high heats because it just creates a ton of trans fatty acids. Really bad for you. So you only half fill the pan, like you see it here. Don't worry what chefs tell you. They work with different types of heats. As you have at home, they have gas burners that run on much higher gas pressure, so much more heat comes out. But what you need to do at home is to keep so-called hot spots in your pan, and when you turn your steak, you place it onto a new hot spot, while the other spot where I just had my steak can recover. From here over there, and the spots can always recover, and so on, back and forward. More color, more flavor, more love. So, does that make sense to you? Now the cold meat, when I put it in the pan the first time, chills down that spot where you place my meat. The pan then of course will struggle to recover as the meat is still cold. You then turn it over onto the same spot. The pan gets even colder, and the heat collapses, and next to your steak will actually simmer rather than fry. It's not nice. Okay, let's go back to salting. So if you salt your steak several hours beforehand, you actually add some real benefits to your steak, like longer salting will tenderize the meat a little as it denatures the surface proteins. After 20 minutes or so of salting, you will find that the sweat of the meat juices I described before will slowly get reabsorbed by the meat, as well as the meat has developed a softer texture as the salty brine disrupts and denatures the proteins and unwinds them and tenderizes them. I mean, it all sounds so great, but there are a few things that you need to know. Meat or steaks consists of cells and fibers, and they are shaped into grains. I mean, I'm sure you heard about that cutting your meat across the grain will make it more tender. Well, this method I've shown you here mainly works with meat cuts that have been cut across the grain where the cells or the fibers have been exposed, like you see here. In your traditional steak cuts, if you, for example, have a hanger steak, a flank steak, a round top, basically, or a Scotch fillet, basically what you left in a whole piece where the grain is intact and the meat is not cut open against the grain, the salting method takes you up to 10 times as long. So it could literally take you days to achieve the same what you achieve here in an hour or two, because the salt struggles to penetrate through those intact, undamaged meat fibers. Here are a few other tips to perfect your steak that are often asked but hardly ever explained. Bringing the meat to room temperature in a matter of minutes is literally complete rubbish. Literally would take you hours and hours to get the meat to room temperature, and it's literally highly unhygienic, and flies go in and all sorts of things. I actually do the opposite. When I have a really thin steak, I chill it in the freezer for 20 or 30 minutes. So I can actually work, the outside chills down, and then I can pound it with much more heat and get a much better crust on it. The meat will heat anyway during the resting, especially if your steak is quite thin. Now, searing the meat to close the pores, to entrap the juices. Oh, it sounds so fantastic, isn't it? I mean, it really does. Now, that information is well over 100 years ago. It was invented or introduced by a German food scientist, and August Escoffier, the famous chef, he loved the idea and he spread it throughout the whole chef and cooking world. And it turns out it's complete rubbish, Close the pores. I mean, where are the pores? I mean, you have pores on skin, but cut up muscle, there are no pores to seal. Anyway, so how often do you turn your steak? Well, there's a lot of shit information out there, So here's my answer. You turn your steak according to the thickness. Steakhouses always give you really thick steaks and has an amazing crunch. Thick steaks are easier to cook. It's extremely hard to cook a thin steak. Now, most chefs actually avoid thin steaks, but supermarkets sell you thin steaks. So if you have a thin steak, you need a super hot pan. You need to keep some serious hot spots, and you turn it from here to there, and if you're lucky, you might get some really good color on the top side, where you serve it without overcooking it. You also have another problem, which is the resting. Most of the time you need to do it outside the pan, because the pan will be simply too hot and the steak will cook through. But if my steak is thick, I can turn it, I can brown it, and by doing so build huge amount of flavors all around. Also, I will not overheat the meat surface and therefore not push its juices too much inwards, and through that dehydrate the meat too much right underneath its brown surface. You see, I rather cook a double-sized steak and then I cut it after resting and divide it between two plates. Now, finally, a thermometer will only work for thicker steaks, not thinner steak. Think about it, you cook a steak on a barbecue, the surface temperature of the meat would be really high, much higher than in a pan. You then rest it, and then you check the temperature, it's all perfect, and your steak will literally become well done in no time. Resting, I need to explain that a little bit. In proteins, the heat will travel inwards from the outer layers, while the juices accumulated in the center travel outwards. And by doing that, the moisture will repopulate in dried out meat fibers, creating really even temperature through the whole steak, as well as the juiciness will adjust itself when the water between the muscle fibers mingles with the broken down proteins, creating a sort of an almost internal gravy. Oh, sounds so good, isn't it? Well done. I mean, not my steak. Anyway, I could go on here for another hour, but all I can say is future videos. Now I'm ready to have my steak, and I hope you liked the video. Check out my video on how to cook the juiciest steak to learn a trick that is simply mind-blowing. And thank you so much for watching.